welcome to the Reparenting Daily podcast. You are our first guest, so I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us, to join us on the journey. I found you via Instagram as I've been setting up this project, and some of your content really spoke to me and your experience as well. So I wanted to have you on our podcast to share a bit more about your experience, what it is exactly that you do, and what you would like to add to the reparenting community, because you also have your own podcast as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me, first of all.
Yes.
So I'm Melissa, I'm a reparenting coach. I found reparenting, I would say I was kind of inspired by my motherhood journey to find reparenting.
Okay.
I trained to be a coach 8 years ago, almost 8 years ago. And I would say the reparenting niche kind of found me. I trained just after I'd had my first daughter, who's now 6, in kind of inner child work and trauma work. And it moved me. All I can say is it moved me so much that I found that was my calling, right? Because then I started to do it for other people and it clicked. And I really believe that everybody in this world needs a bit of reparenting, not because like maybe they had such like we all have a different spectrum of experience. So maybe some people feel, oh, my parents did an amazing job. And it's not to say that they didn't. Some people would totally disagree with that and say they did do a terrible job. But I think that there's always room to be more tender with ourselves and be more compassionate with ourselves, to really learn how to give ourselves the best thing that we need at that moment. I think culturally we're not very good at doing that. So part of my mission is to really help people identify where we don't put ourselves first and do the right thing for ourselves and learn to start doing that.
Really understand. I resonate a lot with what you're saying in terms of how you've come across reparenting, your experience of kind of falling into it. That's the same way that I've kind of stumbled upon it as well. And what's more is I think how you've emphasized, or how you pointed out, I should say, that reparenting is really something that's needed on a mass level. And I think my perception of how I've understood this is that many people in society have had parenting that's good enough, which said Donald Winnicott, right? The good enough mother, the person who created this. And I think once people have reached that threshold of good enough parenting, even if it wasn't perfect, even if there were some problems, it seems that people are better or able to navigate their lives with by relying on vices, such as some people drinking or gambling, whatever the person has chosen. But it seems there's like a tipping point where some people can swing enough of the, coping mechanism to, sustain their life in a way that doesn't crash, but they're still not thriving, right? Whereas some people, they didn't reach that good enough threshold so that, when they start to use these coping mechanisms, there's actually a harder crash. And so even though we might, as a society, only notice the people who are having the really, really hard time, I think many people in society are relying on external coping mechanisms, addictions to processes or substances or relationships, and many other things. So I do agree with you that this is much needed for not just people who are in crisis, but as society raises our consciousness overall,
I completely agree.
Yeah, yeah.
I think we all have control patterns. I practice aware parenting as well, which is
What is that? Yeah,
a way of parenting which is about recognizing that children are in their feeling body. And so like as children, we find these, or babies specifically, we find these coping techniques to numb out our emotions, control patterns. So we all have them. Um, Everybody in society, I've never come across somebody that doesn't have one, and I've been
yeah,
through many in my life, right? I'm sure
yeah,
you have too.
yeah.
So like in my 20s, I worked in the music industry. I used to drink too much, I used to party too much, and then it moved on to, oh well, I'll get into yoga and I'll do yoga a lot. Oh,
Yeah,
and then it
yeah.
was busyness and work and all the different things. It can be anything, right? Exercise, food, all these different things, but it's just a way that we can't hold our emotions. We're
Understood.
not able to sit with ourselves. And you're right, the whole of society is trapped in this way of like trying to run away from ourselves. And wouldn't it be amazing? What a wonderful world it would be if we could start to unpick some of that, whether we're, 60 or 20 or whatever, we just find these moments of awareness where we realize, what am I doing here? What am I running from? Can I
Exactly.
really be with myself?
Yeah, and to breathe, just to take a time and to breathe. I feel that now as I'm doing my first video, I feel some anxiety coming up. So I'm trying to remind myself just to breathe and to be here with you. And maybe if people are listening, they might feel some anxiety coming up because the topic of reparenting is quite heavy. And, there's a reason why people would like to kind of stay in denial if they can at all swing that. Um, but moving on from that part, what would you say is the most challenging part as a reparenting coach because or maybe actually there's a synergy because I'm not a parent. So for this question, you're reparenting yourself, you're parenting your children, your two girls or one girl, one boy,
Two girls, yeah.
two girls, and then you're also being a reparenting coach. So how do you see these? There's a lot of roles, a lot of parenting roles. Do you see them enforcing each other, or do you see there are challenges or advantages in this kind of lifestyle?
I think for me, it really works. They work in synergy. I have to watch the balance because there's moments where one role takes over too much.
Yeah.
And I kind of see reparenting as also very similar to IFS, to parts work, internal
Yes,
family
internal family
system.
system.
So sometimes I find that the mother role gets too big, right? And maybe I would call it the maiden, but it's like,
Yeah,
the coach role, the one that's like really in our fire and our power, like shrinks. And then sometimes the
okay.
maiden or the coach role gets too big, and I'm like, oh, I've kind of neglected my other role or whatever. But I do feel
Understood.
that they work in synergy because ultimately it's about finding that point of balance, isn't it? Finding that place where you nurture each part of yourself and okay, this feels right in this moment. And this, of course, you never know when you're out of when you're out of balance is the moment that right,
Sure.
that where the balance is.
Yeah,
But I do feel like they feed each other because ultimately, if I'm being really good to myself, then I've got enough to give to my clients. Then I've got enough to give to my girls and
understood.
to my partner as well. It's all part of it. And I think in this life, it's trying to really listen to that, where society teaches us, going back to what we were saying before, society teaches us that in order to be valuable in the world, we've got to have this big career, we've got to be successful and we've got to make the money and do the things. And
The
it's
house, a
really
vacation.
listening. Exactly. And yeah, have the house and have the car and have all the other things. And it's listening
Yeah.
to ourselves, what feels right for us. Where are we being kind to ourselves rather
Mm,
than listening to what society expects of us or what we've been taught
exactly.
is what we're meant to do. And that's the real reparenting work. It's untangling all the conditioning, right? It's
Yeah.
untangling all the stories and all the narratives that we build up completely subconsciously. And they're tricky. They're tricky to see,
Very
but
tricky.
when it doesn't feel good for ourselves in our body, if it doesn't feel good in our body, it's not good for us.
Not at all. And this kind of hedonistic or materialistic, it keeps living. It keeps you on the hamster wheel. You're always looking for the next, I don't know, the next pair of shoes or the next vacation or the bigger house or even for relationships, the next better partner or something. And it's all externally referenced. You're right. It's when you're not actually coming and reflecting your original desires and not aligning with yourself. And some of these, you're right again, some of those, what do you call it, life traps, they can be really difficult to identify because you can even be in denial to yourself or gaslighting yourself about some things in order to protect your ego or in order to manage the amount of pain that you're facing at a certain moment. And and that's something that I'm in the process of doing now. I'm about 4 years into this journey. And for me, reparenting, I'm having to focus both on remothering and refathering at the same time. And so interestingly, from your question, how does it feel for you to remother yourself and your clients, or maybe you're doing reparenting, remothering, and refathering? Um, but yeah, the point of the question is you're manifesting some kind of the feminine archetype, like this maternal energy. If you think about Jungian psychology and how there are these two poles, a masculine energy and a feminine energy, and how are how do you balance the development of these archetypes within yourself, right? At the same time, because they are oppositional, right? The father figure has completely different characteristics that you need to develop within yourself than the nurturing side. The remothering is nurturing and the refathering is self-protection, in a basic sense. And so one thing that I found that when you're trying to do both for yourself, you're in a tug of war, right? Because there was not there was not a path given, right? It was not like you were instructed into or seen a model of certain feminine or masculine energy or a certain mother or father figure that you were trying to internalize. And so when you're in the process of doing that, have you seen in your clients that it's a challenge for them to determine if they need to emphasize the remothering or refathering at a certain moment? And how do you help them work through that?
It's a really good question. And it's a really
Yeah.
big part of the work that I do as well. It's a really big part of the work that I've done on myself and that I help clients with, because you're right, there is these two, we're dualistic in nature. So there's these
Yeah.
two polarities and we swing between them. And so and I would say that yeah, the feminine archetype is much more nurturing, like you say, and the masculine is much more protective. But in that way, they work together, right? So you can
Mm,
nurture and nurture and nurture, and then you also know you have to like pull yourself back from and protect yourself from too much giving and too much um wanting to be out there in the world, I guess. The way I do it with my clients is actually sometimes it's kind of like parts work. I get them to speak to the different sides of themselves. Sometimes I get
mm,
them to move their chair, right?
okay.
So from
Yeah.
one side, because I do a lot of online stuff, one side to the other. Like, what does this one part of yourself say?
Yeah.
What's the feminine side of you saying? It's not always the labeled the
Yeah.
feminine,
Absolutely.
because sometimes it can be, for example, a conflict about wanting to move forward and work and also wanting to just rest for a while. So it might
Yeah.
be like the driven one and the resting one. And
Yeah.
they give it whatever names they want, but it usually
Yeah.
relates to this feminine, masculine
Yeah.
parts of
Yeah.
ourselves.
True.
And I get them to have a conversation between the two, because
Yeah.
this internal conflict is usually different parts of ourselves that are just not able to integrate, either because we haven't had the role model at home in our personal experience or in
Mm,
society. We also don't have that role model. We live in a
mm,
patriarchy that ultimately
yeah.
rewards go, go, go. We don't rest, we keep going. And so there will be conflict because we've picked up on that subliminally, right?
Mm,
So, but I find if you can just allow somebody the space to really hear and feel the different parts of themselves that are in conflict, they will come to their own resolution. Their
okay.
body and their intuition will give them the answer that they need. And sometimes they need to make a deal. Like,
Yeah.
this side's allowed to do this, but I'm scared of
Yeah.
that, so you can't do that. This side's
Yeah.
allowed to do this, but I'm scared of that, so you can't do that. And they make a deal, and then it's like there's an integration and a softening that happens. And usually that helps them move forward on whatever struggle they're having.
Yeah, that sounds really uh, interesting to something that I was listening to the other day about the integration of the your shadow, right? And how that leads to more full self-expression. It's kind of the same process in a way because you're increasing your self-knowledge by reparenting yourself, which if you had the good enough parenting, then perhaps that would have been there. That wouldn't mean that you wouldn't have a shadow because everyone does. But in the terms of reintegrating your lost parts or your shattered parts, it really does empower you for more full self-expression, you know? And self-expression comes in so many ways. And I think that that breakdown of self-expression is what leads to a lot of symptoms for people with complex PTSD or people who are in the situation where reparenting is required. Normally, it's not, this is not an easy path. It's not the fairy tale path. It's a path of hard work, but a path of big rewards also too at the end. And I've seen that repeatedly in programs and people who I've spoken to. Um, it's important to remain on hope because one thing that I know is that whether you believe that you can or you can't, you are correct and you will succeed. And some of the challenges that some of us are facing for reparenting are quite, they put us in kind of, for example, the idea that we heal in a relation, we are broken in relationship, and yet we must heal in relationship as well. This is another like a dualistic thing that we have to face, you know. And one of the challenges in reparenting, or one of the most important pieces, the cornerstones, is the capacity to establish those safe relationships, to be seen, to be known, to co-regulate, to decrease the stress and cortisol, and just to feel safe and at peace and valued and a sense of belonging. That's based on something organic, not something superficial, right? That's the one that's really what we're really looking for, the one that's going to nourish us. And today it seems increasingly difficult to find those spaces where people can feel safe. And so, what is something that your clients have been doing, or something that you have done, or that you even might suggest to them that people do in order to find, or first of all, maybe to first establish or build up the courage to seek those safe places and those supportive connections? Because sometimes after a lifelong pattern of abuse, you're kind of deflated. The second part is how do you orient yourself into finding the right types of places? And the last is how do you determine and keep yourself safe? Like, what is an effective strategy for keeping yourself safe, how to approach that within the relational world as you're trying to connect.
I think it's a really big question. And I think it's going to really depend on the person. But there's going to
Yeah.
be two basic guidelines that I would give. And the first would be boundaries, because obviously, if you've come from a past experience where your boundaries have been challenged in relationships, where
Mm,
people have continually not protected you and not been that divine feminine, divine masculine, or whatever, like not you've not been parented in a way that is safe for you, then you need to learn what does feel safe. What are the boundaries for you? And like I say, that'll be different for every single person
yeah.
depending on their experience. But it's really challenging yourself to say where have I had my boundaries crossed and where is it important for me to be really strong in my boundaries now moving forward as I orient myself in new relationship. And what I'd say in terms of actually finding those spaces is to feel what feels good for you, right? So for some people, it might feel safer to join an online group. For some people, it
Yeah.
might feel safer. Maybe it's like, oh, I'm really inspired to go and do an art class, or I'm really inspired to do a jogging club or something like that. But it's coming from your heart, right? It's coming from
Yeah.
this lifts me up and it feels good. And so I'm going to go out there and put myself in this space that feels good. Because then obviously you're more open, right?
Mm,
And you'll attract in the tribe that you're
exactly.
looking for, or at least one or two relationships that you're looking for. But underneath that is trust, right? You need to cultivate trust in the world again. That's the most important thing because when we have a negative experience in our relationship, it's really difficult to find that trust. And that's why I always say lead from the heart. So lead from the heart in terms of like finding the space, lead from the heart in terms of opening up, lead from the heart in terms of establishing those boundaries, right? As soon as it doesn't
Yeah.
feel good, you pull back again.
Yeah.
Okay, I've hold myself again. What feels good to me right now? What do I need right now? How do I tend to myself? How do I honor myself? It's a
So
really
on.
big
So
process. It's huge,
really
but
big process.
yeah, but it's also like courageous.
Yeah.
The most courageous thing that somebody can do to go out there and try and do that for themselves in the world.
Yeah. One question that I forgot to ask you in the beginning is how did you actually find reparenting? Did you read a book or did someone tell you about it or you read it in a journal or
Um,
something or
To be honest, how did I find it? I think that the main, I can't remember if I read about it before this, but
mm,
I did a training with Dr. Shefali, who is like a very famous psychotherapist in America, and she does something called conscious parenting, but it basically is reparenting. I did a very in-depth 6 month trauma
okay.
training with her, and that was the first time that I remember feeling held in my inner child, like, and not just my
Mm,
inner child, my inner adult, and really understanding some of the things that happened to me in my life and understanding that, oh, actually, I hadn't, even though I'd done lots of therapy and I'd done lots of other things, I hadn't really processed them and I wasn't really holding myself in the way that I
mm,
knew that I could. I did a lot of work around like my parents' breakup, my dad moving to the other side of the world when I was a child,
yeah.
not really having a father figure around. I did a lot of work around becoming hyper independent. That was like my coping mechanism to just,
Understood.
I'll do everything on my own. I'm the strong one. I hold it all together. All of that it had to crumble within me. And then from
Mm,
there, I rebuilt it. But there's been various moments where it felt like the inner child work or the inner adult, the parts work came in for me in a very serendipitous way. Where I was like, ah, this is the work
mm,
that I'm here to do. It feels
yeah.
right for me to do this.
That's really good. That's really good. And your children are very lucky to have you as a mother, to be set on the right path with at least this understanding, they will be able to function, much better, than many people in the world, I think, just by having their reality validated, by having, as much of their true selves reflected back to them as you can manage, and that's really the most important gift you can give them. I think they'll be so thankful for that. And, that's, what we are working through as we try to reparent, to find a way to recover that lost opportunity for mirroring and to feel ourselves. Um, Another question that I would like to ask is when you're in the process of working with clients on reparenting, what is the most challenging or most frustrating um, challenge that people have, I should say? What's the most recurring theme that you hear that where people are stuck in reparenting
I think it's just falling back into their patterns, right? The
into the
generational
patterns?
patterns.
Yeah,
So we all
yeah,
have our own individual generational pattern, and it
yeah,
didn't start with us, right? It
yeah,
ricochets and
it
ricochets,
definitely
and
did.
sometimes they can be really, really strong.
Yeah,
Um, and so, and I think people think that they just need to put loads of effort to get through it, but that's actually not the way
yeah,
through it.
yeah,
Often the way through it is to fully surrender,
mm,
to really be accepting of what is alive within us and to be with it and to, because the more resistance we put up against it and the more it holds on, right? And everybody has their own pattern. Like I say, this could apply to so many different ways of being perfectionism or, procrastination, or like these are just small ones, but anything,
yeah,
being unable to show up for our kids because we weren't shown that, all those different things. But the more that we fight them, the more that they,
stick
persist
around. Yeah,
rather than when we can really, and this is the crux, I think, of reparenting. It's like if we can really soften and accept ourselves and accept all parts of ourselves, that's when the shift takes place. And we can be
exactly.
like, you know, it's not such a big deal and I can let it go. And actually, I can be different because I've let it go. And yeah, surrender is a huge concept that I really try and work with my clients, and there's many, many layers to it. But
And
like everybody
try to
takes it in
repeat
their
it.
own time and has their own process with it.
Yeah, indeed. Do you ever suggest, or maybe for yourself even, you have some kind of trinkets, or I don't know, some people will wear like a bracelet or a ring or something to help them pull themselves out of a flashback or out of a certain moment where they're perhaps about to go down that traditional family uh, pattern or that reaction pattern or that thought pattern? Are those things that you have used in your practice?
I don't really use anything material. I just
Okay,
use,
the
mind, body,
brain.
spirit. So it's
Okay,
like
okay.
really going it, and I think the main thing also is to hold space with the emotion because it's another control pattern. When these patterns come up, it's like you're running from the discomfort, the emotion that's alive within you. So the more that you
Mm,
can learn to hold the emotion and really be with the discomfort, really be with the full force of the anger or the shame or whatever it is that's alive in you, then you can move through the pattern. But first we need to learn how to hold our emotions, right? And of course you can use various things
without
for that.
react to him.
Yeah, well, without
Yeah,
being lost in the drama, again, it's like
yeah,
sometimes taking a step back, and because the minute you can see what's going
yeah.
on, you can see a pattern,
Let's
you can
see.
see, oh, I'm doing this.
Sometimes,
You've actually stepped away from the drama then.
yeah,
And I say to my clients, this is the hardest bit. What you've done now is you're not enacting it. You've stepped
yeah,
out. It's like with meditation. You can see the thoughts. Okay,
yeah.
so that's kind of you meditating, right? Same with the pattern. I can see the pattern. So the awareness is there. That's the hard bit. Now, can you hold the emotion and
Mm,
not get swept into the tidal wave of what's happening? Just sit with yourself, sit with it, and
exactly.
then be the observer rather than, the actor in the whole thing.
Yeah, the reactor,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
That's what I was getting at in terms of the materialistic or physical things, because sometimes for myself and others, you can be so swept away in the heat of the moment if you really lack that history of co-regulation and emotional regulation, maybe with another. So, and for myself, I have like this textured ring. I've used other things like a rubber band to snap so when I find myself reaching like a point where it's difficult for me to take this step back because Now, after a few years, I'm better able to do that, without using any assistance. But sometimes I really needed something physical to help distract me, like come from my mind into my senses. Sometimes they say like splash cold water on your face, or I don't know, do something that will cold shower, something that's gonna break your nervous system out of that. But yeah, if you're in the middle of a meeting, you can always take a cold shower. So sometimes you just have to twist a ring or something like that. So yeah, that's why I was going with that question. Um, but yeah, that's yeah, it's the probably the first step in reparenting, right? Is creating the emotional regulation. Because if you cannot stabilize from that chaotic emotional flashback, which is most likely what people are struggling with when they are having to come back to these moments of reparenting, right? Because it's something that happened in the past, emotions that are coded are coming from the past. And so we want to take some time and to make sure that the tools that we're implementing to respond to those emotions and to not react, to not judge and to react, that requires slowing down. It requires accessing the prefrontal cortex so we can see things more clearly. All of this requires that we are slowing down our nervous system, our level of anxiety, so that we can begin to make more effective decisions. That, for me, is the mechanics of reparenting. Like that's the actual machinery. Because for me, I'm paying attention to those moments. It can honestly be something as simple as waking up when you wake up with the abandonment melange, like from Pete Walker, um, having to having the capacity to step outside of that as soon as you wake up, and then to rationalize, these emotions, to understand that they're not coming from the present, but they are coming from the past. While at the same time feeling them, there are many different moving pieces, but the first step is to be able to pause and to not judge and then react to those emotions that you're feeling and just to observe them. And how you get there can be different for many people, I think. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
it's
One
really
last,
powerful. Go on, sorry.
no, 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 go
I
ahead.
was just going to say it's really powerful for you to explain it that way. It's exactly that,
Yeah,
and yet also I think sometimes we need the triggers because then it allows us to
exactly.
understand ourselves. And
Yeah,
there's probably never going to be this time in the future where we're not triggered by
yeah,
stuff. Hopefully,
yeah.
I think I think it was a Louise Hay. I saw this video years ago. The author and the founder of Hay House Publishing. She
Yeah,
said,
yeah,
like, when we're younger, we see these patterns or these triggers as like these big boulders, and it's like, oh my God, it's such an effort to move them.
yeah,
And as we get older, then they get smaller and smaller and smaller until like hopefully we get to an age where it's like, oh, it's a tiny little pebble, blink, you know.
yeah,
But I think my point is that we're always going to be triggered, but
yeah,
can we have that lightness around it? Can we step away from it in a way that's like, because ultimately this life is here to be played, right? It's
yeah,
we get a chance to find joy in life, and that's only it only comes when we do the work. So at first the work's going to feel like work, but then later can the work feel like
it can become
play?
more play. Yeah,
And can we really like embrace all of these things that are coming up for us with an open heart and say, ah, there we are again. There's something else for us to play with here and not
yeah,
take it too seriously. I think that's also my analogy of reparenting. It's taking us back to being a child, when
mm.
like everything was play and we
At the
could just
beginning.
like, oh, I'll try that and I'll do this. And children are amazing at just teaching us how to be in wonder and in awe and in full belief in ourselves. And
Yeah,
so I feel
yeah,
like it's a circle that we
yeah,
go from that into like the heaviness and the conditioning and all the burden. And then hopefully we come back round again and we let go of it all and we come back into
yeah.
being playful like
That's a
children.
really good point. Play is where it's at, Play is when you are in flow, you're not stressed, you're just in the present moment, And that is the moment when you're able to find your talents, right? And the things that really bring you the reason why you're here, basically, That's how you find yourself, by playing, I think. And how
Yeah.
ironic, we find ourselves by playing. And we're
Yeah.
sitting there
But
stressed reading these books, and all we need to do is play.
I do so much work around play. There's like in my podcast, I talk about it all
Yeah,
the time because I
yeah,
think our conditioning says that, children play and then, but very quickly, it's in this country anyway, and I think in America, it's like, get to school, we must learn, and it's very serious. But
Yeah.
actually, like, play is such a good release of our emotions. It's a way that if we're feeling stressed, we can let it all out. Children enact all of their trauma through play so that they can let it go, right?
Yeah.
And yet we don't make
Exactly.
space for it as adults.
Yeah.
And like before I was specializing in reparenting, I used to specialize in flow, like finding flow.
Okay.
And
Okay.
actually, what I
Right.
found really amazing about the synergy between these two reparenting flow states is that when we're children, we have the same brainwaves as flow. Like until the age of 7, we have theta brainwaves.
And that they.
So like we're always in flow.
Hmm.
And so my goal with the reparenting is to bring us back into flow. Like, can we
Okay.
be like kids
Nice.
again? Can we be like
Nice.
really wide open and able to
Yeah.
believe in ourselves and try everything? And
Yeah.
like that's the key with this reparenting work. It's really to set us free.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time for today. Just one last question. If people are interested to reach out to you or get in contact, how can they find you?
So I'm Melissa Maouris. I've got the Reparenting podcast is probably the best resource out there for you to just dive into. I'm also on Instagram. That's pretty much it. And if you want to just reach out and find out about my group programs or one-to-ones, then you can find me on Instagram or on my website, melissamauris.com.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for taking some time. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this.